Welcome to the Bioethics Babe podcast, where we examine the tough questions in human flourishing in light of science, faith, and culture. I'm your host, Darina Grosso-Agnew. Now let's dive in. IVF was once framed as compassionate care for couples struggling with infertility. Today, it has evolved into a designer baby industry, marketed as optimization, ranking embryos, screening traits, and promising families their quote-unquote best baby. My guest today is Tara Sander Lee, a Harvard-trained biochemist and founding board member of the Science Alliance for Life and Technology. She's a former scientific director of molecular diagnostics at Children's Hospital of Wisconsin and previously served as vice president and director of life sciences at the Charlotte Lozier Institute. Tara has testified before Congress and state legislatures, but she also brings something rare to this conversation: personal experience with infertility and IVF. In this episode, we examine when human life begins from a scientific standpoint, how embryos are graded and selected in IVF labs, and the rise of polygenic risk scores, and why designer babies are no longer science fiction, but a business model. This is a conversation about science, power, and the moral limits we can't afford to ignore. Tara, welcome to Bioethics, babe.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
To begin, tell us about your path into science. What originally drew you to this field, and what eventually pulled you toward bioethics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say what drew me to science started back when I was a child, probably as early as like elementary school, maybe 8, 9 years old. I just always loved science. I loved anything having to do with the human body and just trying to understand how the human body worked. And so then I asked for a microscope for one Christmas, and I got a microscope. And so as I dug through the things that they provided, the feathers, the brine shrimp, I was like, oh, this is so boring. I don't want to be looking at feathers and brine shrimp. So much to my parents' dismay, I actually would prick my finger to actually get blood that I would try to put underneath the microscope. And so very early on, I just realized how much I really wanted to understand how the human body worked and to know how we were designed by God to be fearfully and wonderfully made. And so it really started early. And then I just continued to pursue avenues in research and medicine that would help me to better understand human development. And that really took me down several paths, both as my Ph.D., then as my postdoctoral training, and then ultimately running my own laboratories, in which the focus was always trying to better understand the pathology of disease, why some children are born with certain diseases, and then how we can, with advancements in medicine and technology, help to repair those defects. And so probably one of the best examples that I just loved was that when I was at Harvard, we worked very hard to understand how some children and why some children were born with congenital heart defects, why the valves when they were born didn't quite work correctly and open and close the way that they should. So we would actually look at the diseased valve to understand why it wasn't working correctly. And then actually in full circle, then when I was directing a lab later on in life, a genetics lab, we actually developed a new genetics test that was used by doctors shortly after the baby was born to determine exactly what type of heart defect they had. And then they could go in and then do the surgery within days after birth to correct that specific defect. So that's just always been an interest for me, to really apply both understanding the disease and then how to use advanced treatments to help repair the disease or to provide healing. As far as where my path and journey started to shift, there were a lot of different things that were kind of happening. I was recently married. We were trying to build our own family. I was suffering from miscarriages, and just had a better understanding of pregnancy and loss and what was happening there. We were blessed to have our own child naturally, but just better understanding personally what it was like for a human being to live and then to have that loss. At that same time, I was actually, when I would drive to work, I was working late hours. God just had these things just happen at just the right time. I would pass a church and I would see all these blue and pink crosses on the lawn that were to honor the millions of babies that were aborted each year in this state. I mean, in the country and around the world. I also heard this really disturbing radio broadcast on Christian radio. It was very haunting, in which they were putting beads. They were like pouring beads that represented the number of human beings that like died in previous world wars. The American Revolution, the World War II, and then they poured the number of beads that into a jar that represented the number of babies that have been killed by abortion. And that just, I mean, that just completely was a life altering moment for me, to really understand the impact of how many lives were being lost to abortion. And I began to better understand in vitro fertilization and how many embryos were being lost through in vitro fertilization, which the numbers are astronomical and could be as high as, 500 million. And so then I would say what really then started the path of me actually speaking up, where God really put his hand on me and said, I'm calling you to do this, to use everything that you have learned in your science to now be a voice for the voiceless, was when at our institution, they started to stand up against bans that were being introduced into our state that would ban the use of aborted fetal tissue. And this happened on the heels of the Delighting videos that came out that really exposed the horrors of this human fetal trafficking, the body parts of babies that were being harvested shortly after abortion and then were being sold to these researchers, that desired to use these body parts to use them in their research experiments. And it was then that the institution really kind of spoke on behalf of all scientists and said, we need to stop this ban. We need this tissue. And I knew from my own experience in my own laboratory, it's like, no, we don't. I know we don't need this tissue. Like, I'm using human tissue and it's from a very ethical source. They're from consenting parents. It's from consenting children that have already living, and it's like discarded tissue that they don't need anymore. I mean, I was using it every day in my lab. And so we just started speaking up and saying, hey, you can't speak on behalf of all scientists. This research is actually really wrong, exploiting human beings. And this, human beings are not a means to an end. And so that's really where my path started to change, because I started to slowly better understand just, while medicine could provide this incredible healing for human beings. And I embraced that as a scientist. I said, this is incredible, right? Humans can do amazing things. God has blessed us with all these incredible advancements and technologies that can help people. There really is an ethical line but if you think it's okay to hurt a human being in the process or rely on the destruction of a human being in the process, that is absolutely wrong, because God designed us there is dignity and there's sanctity in human life. And so all of those things were weaving together within about the same period of time. And God just said, it's time for you to move out, and he wanted me to start speaking up for the littlest ones among us, and to start using that science. It's just so interesting, because when I look back, I remember thinking, wow, he's really having me do so many eclectic different things. I'm learning so much about human development and all these different types of diseases, but he just used that all so that now when speaking up for them, I have a better understanding from the very basic human development, but from all the different diseases and the treatments that can come from that ethically without hurting any human being.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. And your voice is so necessary, especially since you have such a rich scientific background. You are also founding member of the Science Alliance for Life and Technology, also known as SALT. What is the mission of SALT, and why did you want to be a part of it?
So SALT stands for Science Alliance for Life and Technology. And we are a new organization, just as we are called to be the salt of the earth. And we are called, SALT preserves, salt seasons. We are really looking to season the culture with salt. And what does that mean? Well, that really means that we want to season public debate. We want to preserve that God-given dignity of each and every human being. in science and technology. So as we navigate all these new advancements in technology, everything from, IVF to adult stem cells that are being used ethically to treat millions worldwide, to the eugenic practices that we are seeing with IVF, to human cloning, which has not gone away. There are just all these technologies that are right at our doorstep, or they keep, they keep they keep coming back, like the human aborted fetal tissue. Some things just don't go away. But as these new advancements come on, we really want people to better understand the science. We want to educate the public and policymakers so that they understand the science and the ethics of these technologies and have a better understanding as to what do they do? What does it mean whether they do or do not respect the dignity and sanctity of every human life from the moment of conception until natural death? And so that's what our goal is. We're excited to help as many people that will listen to better understand the science and the ethics, and how science can progress and advancements can be made, but they can be made ethically so that they do not rely on the destruction or harm of any human being. And they're being done all the time. There are so many ethical alternatives available. So we want people to better understand what's going on and how best to do the best ethical science.
And we're so grateful that SALT exists, and I know it will become a leader in this as well. From a scientific viewpoint, when does a new human life begin, and what evidence from embryology and genetics supports this?
So it is a scientific fact that from the moment of fertilization, when the sperm fuses with the egg, that there is a creation of a new, totally distinct human being, a child that is biologically distinct from every other life form and human being in the world, is a unique human being, and there will never be another one like it from the moment of that sperm egg fusion. And so the dynamics of fertilization are very well understood and established from centuries of biological discovery. We understand that all these stages of fertilization are well known and they're established. And probably the best way to explain this is that the Carnegie stages of development, which were first established in 1942, they are the standard used by all biologists and embryologists to describe human embryo development. And embryo is just a term that I use to describe the first stage of human development. It's no different than using the term like toddler or infant or teenager. But these Carnegie stages, there's 23 Carnegie stages. And the very first stage of human development, which is when human life begins, is Carnegie stage 1A. And it is marked by the very moment of fertilization when human life begins. There's countless scientific papers that document the organismal functions of human embryos from the one cell stage at the very beginning all the way through development. So and we know that this is a human organism, a living human organism at the moment of conception, and it is undeniable. And that's not even to mention that the DNA that, because mom has 23 chromosomes, dad has 23 chromosomes, and only when those come together and fuse do we actually have a complete genome that defines a unique human being. And that is present from the very moment, the one cell zygote stage of the human embryo.
That's beautiful. And is there a zinc spark? Can you tell us about that? What happens at that very moment of sperm egg fusion?
So there definitely is a zinc spark. I think some people think that you actually can see it with the naked eye, right? But there were actually they use tools to be able to actually visualize that zinc spark. So you can't actually see it, the light. God sees it though, right? We know that in that hidden place inside the womb, there is something miraculous that is happening at that moment of the sperm egg fusion. And it is life. It is life that immediately happens at the moment of that fusion. And it is life that there will never be another one just like it. So yes, the zinc spark is real. It's just that you can't see it with the naked eye.
You mentioned that there are ethical ways of doing research and unethical ways. So what does it actually mean to respect human dignity in science, not rhetorically, but practically? And what does that look like when you're doing real scientific research and clinical practice?
I mean, there's a lot of different examples, and I think we'll get into some of those, but I think it's best for me to just summarize what it looks like at a very general level. And it means that no matter what the end goal, no matter what the treatment, no matter what the research, no matter what the advancement, no matter what the technology, no matter what you are as a scientist trying to do, no matter what you are as a physician, what treatment you're trying to offer, it should never be dependent on the harm or destruction of any human life, ever, at any age, at any time. And so when I say any age, that means from the moment of conception, because that is a living human being. And that means all the way up to the point of natural death. So that's in general terms, just what it means and what it looks like. And so if we can keep that at the forefront, no matter what the technology, no matter what the goal, that no human being should ever be exploited in the name of science or medicine, no human being should ever be harmed or at risk of harm. That's really what that means.
And I think that brings home the point that the ends don't justify the means. And so you have to have good means and a good end, good intention, and all of the circumstances surrounding it for the act to be good. You spoke about a little bit about your own journey with infertility, but I want to dive a little bit into that. And obviously, infertility is devastating for many couples. And can you share a little bit more about your own experience with infertility and IVF and how it shaped your perspective as a scientist?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was never my husband's and my intent to pursue in vitro fertilization, right? I think so many couples just assume, well, once we are ready to start having a family, you just assume that it's going to work the way that you hope it will. And that was a very devastating day when, you know, the physicians surrounding us told us that we don't think that you can get pregnant on your own. We think that you have less than a 2% chance of getting pregnant on your own. And they said that they really pressured us and said if you want to have your own biological children, the only way to do that is to pursue in vitro fertilization. And that was a devastating day. I remember just bawling in the car, just grieving over that process. So I really understand the pain and suffering of infertility and the roller coaster of emotions in trying to conceive, and knowing what it's like to all of a sudden say, oh my gosh, what my dream was and the way that we wanted to have children, they're now telling me that that's not possible anymore. And they're quickly sending us down this path that you never, and you're so desperate to have a child. I think that's what I want to really emphasize, that I understand not only the pain and suffering of infertility, but just that feeling of desperation, like, oh my gosh, we need to do this now because, I was considered advanced maternal age. I was in my late 30s, and they just make you feel like you're so old and you're never going to be able to have babies. And that if you don't do this now, it's never going to happen. I mean, they were right away, they were telling us maybe you should consider, doing egg donors. I mean, they were throwing all this information at us. Long story short, we ended up then believing them more than we did relying on our faith in God. And we just put our entire lives into their hands, and we're whisked down this road of in vitro fertilization and reproductive medicine. We ended up going through one cycle. 3 embryos were generated, and they were immediately transferred because they weren't considered to be really the highest quality. So they didn't think that really there was a chance for any of them to survive, but they're like, well, let's throw all 3 of them in just in case. And the entire cycle failed. And on top of that, I did not become pregnant. It failed. And then I was actually hospitalized a couple weeks later due to a severe allergic reaction to the progesterone, what they think were the progesterone shots that I was being given to try to maintain the pregnancy if it had occurred. And so just the whole experience of going into reproductive medicine, going through in vitro fertilization was a very painful, bad experience.
Mm. I'm so sorry to hear that. How long after that did you conceive naturally, and what do you think helped that process for you to conceive naturally?
Yeah, so I remember after that whole process, and they still didn't know why they weren't convinced they knew exactly why I had the severe allergic reaction. I had what was called eosinophilic pneumonia. So I was really sick, and I was in the hospital for a while. And after that, it was so interesting. Like, they didn't even know why I had the allergic reaction, but they were ready for me to join. I remember calling them and saying, "Hey, this just happened to me." They're like, "Oh, no problem. We can get you into the next cycle, like, in a couple of months." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, no, like, I almost died."
Mhm.
We don't even know exactly what caused they think they know, but they don't know for sure because that information was just starting to come out, and they were like presenting my case at conferences, and they were writing it up because, but now we know that it's not as rare as they actually once thought. It's a real risk to women. And so I just knew I needed to take a pause because I didn't want to go through that again. I didn't want to, I didn't want to go through what I just went through. So I really took a pause and I really prayed, and I just prayed and prayed. And I remember then we really started to look at holistic approaches, and started to go down that avenue. And I remember even with that, it wasn't work. Nothing was happening right away. I would honestly say that what we were still in this kind of holistic approach. I was taking lots of vitamins and herbs, but then God really made it clear to me, like, you need to lay this down. You need to lay this down and stop trying so hard and let me take care of you. Because
Mhm.
I think there's this desperation to think as a human being, we need to do whatever is possible that we can do, that the doctors can do with their own hands. And you kind of, your eyes start shifting away from God. And God really had to say, no, turn your eyes to me, look to me, and I have a plan for you that is not to harm you, but is for good. And once I laid that down, and I remember thinking to myself, well, I'm laying this down. That must mean that God means I'm not supposed to have children. And I remember I had my 40th birthday, and I'm like, well, I reached my 40th birthday. I guess that's it. No kids for me. And God was like, no, see, I have a plan for you. And literally within a couple of weeks, I found out I was pregnant
Wow.
naturally. And so it was this way of God just reminding me, like, I'm in charge no matter what the doctors say. They told you you had a 2% chance. And I think it was just a reminder to me of what it says in 2 Corinthians 12:9 and 10, right? When you are weak, right? When you are weak, that's when you're strong, because that's when my power can be shown in you, right? And that's why I remember, like, Paul's like, all the more I will boast of my weaknesses. And I remember, like, it was just such a reminder, like, God is more big and powerful than any doctor, any treatment. And I'm not saying that miracles are real. We really see that our son was a miracle from God, and a blessing and a gift after everything that we did to try to do it ourselves. I do know that a lot of couples go through in vitro fertilization and they never have that child that they desired, or they feel pressured to even do go down other paths that they never saw, which I know we're going to get into. There are couples that do end up enjoying that joy of having children right away after going through in vitro fertilization. Everybody's journey is different. And so that's why I so desperately just want to help people understand what the risk, are when it comes to this, because this is one that they can only make with God, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Humans will never have wisdom, right? It is the fear of the Lord that is the beginning of wisdom. We have to turn our eyes towards God to be able to know what his plan is for our life, and to really lay that down at his feet so that he can lead us through, not these doctors that think that they know everything. It's really him leading you through.
Absolutely. And before living it yourself, how did you understand IVF in theory? Can you speak a little bit more? Obviously, you shared your experience with IVF, but how did that understanding shift after your experience with IVF personally?
Like I said earlier, I don't think I never I never thought that in vitro fertilization was going to be an avenue that my husband and I were going to have to go down. So I really didn't think much about in vitro fertilization before we were all of a sudden swept into that office. So I understood the technique and theory from a scientific level, right? I understood reproduction. I understood cell biology. I understood human development. I understood when they told me about the embryo and what was going to happen, and hormones and all that, and the surgery, right? Like, that was the world I was living in at the time, right? Like, I was in a lab one day and I would literally walk down the hall and I'd be in this clinic, going through this procedure. So I was right there. I was right in at the medical institute dealing with this. So I understood scientifically what they were telling me. But I remember, really, because I was so determined to want to make this work, I really didn't take the time to do the research and understand the risks before going into the clinic, and then before going into the procedure. And they fill you with so much hope that it will work. And when I saw the embryos, they refer to them as babies. And of course they are. These are little boys and girls that are children that are at the very beginning stages of life. And so that's good. They embrace that. So they know that, right? They know these are living human beings. But what changed through the whole process and, going through it from the beginning to the end is that when I stepped back and actually had time to process everything, that kind of what I was saying earlier, that I think I gave them so much. I trusted them so much. I trusted them more than I did God. And I realized there was a big reality check. Like, wow, there are some major risks here. They don't have all the answers. They're playing God, but they lack wisdom. They make mistakes. A lot of false assumptions were made. I mean, in addition to the in vitro fertilization, we actually pursued IUI as well, in utero insemination. And, that's just a whole nother story. Like they made so many mistakes. Like they weren't listening to me when I was saying, no, I really don't think this is the right time. And so I think that was what really changed for me as a scientist. Like I was so focused on the science and saying, okay, I got this. But realizing that there's a whole nother side of science that often is ignored. It was kind of like what's going on now in our culture. So there's so much focus on the science and what can be done, and this is what we can do, and the statistics. But let's actually pause and think about ethically, what does this mean and what are the risks, not only to you as a woman and to your husband, but let's now talk about, the risks as to these human embryos and what's going on. And that entire conversation is being missed and ignored in these clinics. And that's to me what was really the eye opener after this whole process.
Right, and we're actually going to get into all of that, the risks to the woman, but now we're also going to talk about some of the ethical pitfalls of this procedure, especially on the babies. So, obviously, many couples struggling with infertility are told that IVF is the obvious or only option. And as a scientist and as a woman who has undergone IVF, can you tell us a little bit more about those ethical pitfalls of this procedure?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will just, preface this by saying that there is a whole area of restorative medicine that doesn't rely on this, right? Like we were talking about, and I know we're not going to get into that, but I just want people to hear that there is another side to this that really avoids these pitfalls that I'm going to be talking about. Probably the biggest one is there's a really high failure rate. Right? For every baby successfully born in the United States by IVF, there have been hundreds of thousands of failed cycles where the couple does not achieve pregnancy. And so what we're finding is that the estimates can be as far as the estimates as far as, the percentage that actually work can be as low as 7% of the cycles that actually work. It could be as high as 35%, but this kind of depends just on the clinic and, how they actually do the procedure, whether they're accredited, whether they're actually doing a good job. Are they paying close attention to the details? So that's a range, but it has a high failure rate. And I saw a recent study actually, which I just found actually, that found that while we're seeing a dramatic increase in the number of cycles that are being performed for IVF, IVF is becoming much more common. We're actually finding that it's becoming less efficient. So I just found one study that found that despite the rapid increase in IVF, we're actually seeing the the efficiency is actually declining. And they were saying that it was like somewhere, I think it had gone down a few points, like from the kind of mid 20s down to the low 20s. And so it's more common, but it is becoming less efficient. And I think that's related to a lot of different things. I mean, we're seeing that they're doing more embryo banking. We're seeing that there's more add-ons, like what we're going to talk about, like actually grading these embryos and actually doing biopsies and trying to find out, which ones are considered the best embryos. But I think the next, besides the high failure rate and it's not efficient, the next thing to really consider is just that most embryos that are created during this process do not survive to birth and will die. So even if we just look at the numbers of, it's estimated that somewhere between like 12 and 17 million babies have been born through IVF worldwide. Even if we assume, okay, let's just say assume that it's the highest percentage of efficiency, that, that 35% will be successful. That's saying that 65 will not, and that's saying that at a minimum, like 22 million babies did not survive the transfer and were not born. So at minimum, 22 million babies have died just through the process of being created and not surviving. That does not include the millions of babies that have been discarded or frozen or not transferred and then did not survive. So the estimates right now, it is astronomical. Just IVF alone, which accounts for 99% of all reproductive measures to try to get pregnant, it's estimated that 90 to 98% of all embryos from IVF are destroyed, discarded, or frozen. So that
Wow.
means that they're killed or they're abandoned in the freezer, never to be seen again. So when we look at these numbers, we're talking in the millions. Like, even if we consider a conservative estimate of 90% of these embryos that are not surviving, that means that equates to about 108 million human beings that
Yeah.
have died in this process. If you consider what like that, if on the higher end, we're talking over 500 million of these embryos. And that's not even to count the 1.5 million embryos that are estimated to be in the freezer and just abandoned there. So the numbers are astronomical when we consider this, of the amount of human life that is being destroyed and harmed in the process. Not to mention the risk to women. My own experience I explained, but there's a whole nother there's a lot of other risks, like developing ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. There's risks when you go in to retrieve the eggs. And not to mention also that this is a really highly unregulated business. And so these reproductive centers are really given a lot of autonomy and flexibility to really run the clinic the way that they want. There's not a lot of regulatory oversight, and that puts even more human beings at risk in the process.
Yeah, it's chilling to think about how many babies are killed or destroyed, or just frozen, after all these procedures. And really, the message that this sends home is that even though IVF is sold as a life affirming option, it actually is an industry of death. As you
Mhm.
mentioned, most babies are either killed or abandoned or used for research that never make it to live birth. And so I think that's important for our listeners to understand about the IVF industry. There's also a recent story about this couple, Tiffany Score and Stephen Mills, where they shared their story about the mix-up of their embryos, and so they ended up having a little girl that was not genetically affiliated with them. Could you tell us about this case and why it's so significant?
Yeah, this is really a sad case. And this poor couple, they discovered after giving birth to their baby that, well, and that's where the question, whose baby is it, right? So they gave birth to the baby, and they just knew right away that genetically was not their baby. They did the test and they confirmed that. And so now they know that there was a mix up, that they got somebody else's embryo, which means then, well, what happened to their embryos? Is somebody else out there now that has where their embryos were transferred and now they have their biological child out there somewhere? And so you can just tell, like, but of course they love this child, right? She carried this child. This child grew inside of her. And so there's it's this really difficult situation now of trying to find this baby's biological parents and then trying to find where are their biological children now. And so it just it exemplifies in a nutshell the problems with IVF, that these children are being treated like commodities, and they're being manipulated, they're being created and manipulated in the lab. These clinics are playing God, and they are human. They will make mistakes. Mistakes will happen. People are going to get hurt. People are getting hurt. And this really also emphasizes what I said earlier, just that this is a major laboratory mistake and a mix up, and that there needs to be better oversight and regulation, not to mention just that this is what's going to happen when laboratories play God, and because there will be mistakes, major mistakes that are being made.
Mhm. Yeah, this story is tragic all around. From what I've learned about this case, now they sued the IVF clinic that was involved, and now they're wanting to test all the babies that were born from this IVF clinic from 2020 to 2025 or to the present, because they don't know at what point their embryos were implanted. Is someone, as you mentioned, pregnant with their biological children, or what's happened? And also they're put in a really tough spot. This couple, from what I've read, really do love this child, but they realize that this child is not theirs genetically, and that this child does have a biological mother and father out there somewhere. And so they're put in a very tough position where they love this child, they have a connection to this child, and yet they also care and that they want this child to be with her parents wherever they are. So it is very tragic. You touched on this before, but what does this case expose about how easily human beings become inventory once reproduction is industrialized, as it has been with the IVF industry?
Yeah, I think probably the best example is this is embryo adoption, I think of. And so if you look at some of these clinics that do offer embryo adoption, they call them snowflake babies, they're given a number, right? Or where you have a baby, embryo 142, right? But then if you look at a picture, then after birth, this is a baby, Emily, right? And so that's always a reminder to me that these embryos are just considered a number at the beginning,
Mm.
even though they build up this kind of false facade to the couples, like, these are your babies, here you go, we're going to transfer your babies. At the end of the day, these laboratories see them as, just like you said, inventory and numbers. And not only they're numbered that way, but like you said, when we talk about just being put in a freezer, this is like basically just keeping track of inventory like you would at a store, right? And do we have all the embryos that we thought do we have all the embryos? But I think we just know that, and the blatant disregard, though, at the end of the day, is so clear when we see how wasteful it is and how many embryos are being destroyed. So they're being handled like inventory, but they're not being handled even as precious inventory, right? Because
Mhm.
they have no problems throwing them in the trash, sending them over to a research laboratory where they will be manipulated and destroyed. They have no problem freezing them, when we know that freeze thaw process, what other human being do we freeze them and thaw? Right? There are consequences to doing that. And so I think that you're absolutely right that this exposes just how human beings in this process are becoming inventory and are just being treated like commodities and products. And they're just given a number, and they're not being seen as a human being with the dignity that they really respect and deserve, and the protection that they deserve.
Right, and some families just don't know what to do with their frozen embryos, and they'll keep them continually frozen for decades. In fact,
Right.
there's babies who have been born decades later. What does that do to siblings, one who was born 20 or 30 years before, who now have siblings who are still frozen embryos? And do those frozen embryos get passed down to the siblings, to their generations? It really does create a mess, not only in the process of IVF, but in the with the effects of it, and what we do with the leftover embryos. And we'll definitely have a show just on the frozen embryo, a debate about the frozen embryo adoption debate. This isn't the show. We're going to touch on a lot of issues, and I really do want to get also to the question of designer babies, as we'll discuss. But to get there, I wanted to familiarize listeners who are unfamiliar with IVF. Can you walk us through the process step by step from egg retrieval to embryo transfer? And you did mention some of the physical effects on the mother, if you can expound on that a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned earlier, in vitro fertilization is really the most common artificial method that allows fertilization of the new human being to occur in vitro. And in vitro just means outside the woman's body or in a petri dish. So the very first successful attempt was in 1978 with the birth of Louise Brown. And as I mentioned earlier, it is estimated that about, anywhere between 12 and 17 million babies around the world have been born using IVF methods. So in the United States, that means that about 1 in every 50 babies born is conceived by IVF. So there's a lot of babies in the United States that have been born through IVF. I want to mention too that IVF was meant to be used as a last resort to help couples with infertility, but we're seeing, as I mentioned earlier, that IVF cycle numbers are increasing significantly, and is now being used as like a quick fix, to kind of help numerous couples that are having trouble getting pregnant. And it does not even treat the underlying condition. It's just used as kind of a workaround and never really addresses what's going on with these couples and why they might be having trouble. But it is a very complex series of procedures. As I mentioned earlier, I did go through this. It was very taxing to the body. It starts with the use of drugs that the woman actually she injects herself with drugs that are hormones that are going to stimulate her ovaries to produce multiple eggs. And so usually in a normal cycle, a woman will produce one egg that is then released, and then, that is usually released then it could go for natural pregnancy. But in this case, they're trying to abnormally stimulate the woman's ovaries to produce multiple eggs. And we're talking, it could be anywhere between, 2, 10, 20, 30. It just depends on the woman, how old she is, and how well that works. Once they know that there is more than one egg that is there, and if it's been successful, then they surgically retrieve those women's eggs. So they actually go in with a needle through the vagina, and then they go to the ovaries and they retrieve those eggs. Then they go back to the laboratory, and after collecting a man's sperm, then they actually combine the women's eggs and male sperm in a lab petri dish. So it's outside of the woman completely in a laboratory. They then grow these human embryos in the lab, and they grow them for about 3 to 5 days. They monitor them, they watch them grow. And then once they have determined which ones they think have the highest success of surviving the transfer and until birth, then they transfer those embryos at about that 5-day-old stage. Those embryos are they're considered a blastocyst at that stage. And then a pregnancy test is taken shortly after that to determine if implantation was successful. But at that point, there's at that point along the line, there's a lot of risks in the process. Like we had talked about, there's risks to the woman. So some risks, physical injury to women that undergo IVF, as I mentioned earlier, could be this ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, or OHSS, in which her body, which is being stimulated to produce all these eggs, she produces even more than she should. And the woman's ovaries actually adversely overreact to the hormones. And then her ovaries become swollen and painful and possibly leaking fluid. So it's very serious. And so then they need to go in, and hospitalization and treatment might be required. As I mentioned earlier, you can have allergic reactions to different hormones and the injections that are being used. That's what I experienced. You can have surgical complications during the egg retrieval, which can also be pretty serious. And so I think those are just some of the main ones that we need to be aware of, and not to mention, again, just the risk to the embryos throughout the entire process. But those are the main ones for women during the process that they should be aware of, that this does not go without serious potential physical risks.
Right. And you mentioned that obviously the eggs and the sperm are fertilized in a petri dish. And could you talk a little bit about the fact that there's even two ways of fertilizing these eggs? There's one called ICSI, where you just insert a sperm into an egg, and then one where it's a more natural process, and maybe what effects those different types of ways of fertilizing can actually have on the embryos themselves.
Yeah, I'm not really an expert in this area, but I do know that there is some evidence that, like you said, that ICSI procedure, that where instead of having it all happen naturally where, you have the eggs and you have the sperm and it just kind of naturally occurs. They actually pick what they think is the best sperm and they actually inject it into the egg. I don't know this area very strongly, but I know that there are risks to that as well. And I don't think that it works as well as they hope that it's going to. So,
Right. Because in the natural process, the strongest sperm will reach the egg. But when a lab technician chooses the sperm, that might not be the strongest sperm. And so,
right.
again, it goes back to your point about scientists and lab technicians playing God and creating life. Generally, it can lead to a lot of problems, obviously. And we'll talk about some of that. But biologically speaking, is a human embryo created through IVF any different from one conceived naturally in the womb?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So a human being that is conceived through the natural process where the conception happens inside the womb and implantation happens inside the womb, that human being is no different than the embryo that was created outside the womb in a petri dish and then transferred back into the woman. They only differ in where and how their conception occurred. And so that's what's really important, that if you look at these embryos from in vitro fertilization, like these are human beings and they're very young, tiny human beings, 5 days old, and they're gonna look the exact same as they do inside the womb. And so we owe them the exact same bioethical consideration, whether no matter how and where and when they were conceived.
Exactly. And obviously, they have the same dignity and the same value. No matter how you're conceived, you
Right.
have human dignity. What we're trying to make people aware of in this conversation and in other conversations about IVF is to try to prevent more embryos from being created in this way because of all of the different ethical reasons that we already discussed. But obviously, the value of an embryo or a person who's been born through IVF is not to be questioned. In fact, they have equal dignity and equal value. IVF clinics routinely grade embryos based on morphology and development speed. What is human embryo grading and how does it work?
Yeah, that's what's very concerning about, there's a lot of risk when it comes to in vitro fertilization, but this next part that we're gonna go into really starts to get at what do we consider a healthy embryo before, for transfer. So the first standard technique that is pretty much used by all laboratories is going to be this morphology screen that you talked about, which really involves a detailed evaluation of the embryo structure and development, which embryos are going to have the highest chance of implanting successfully into the mother's womb and surviving until birth. And so this morphology is really complemented by just traditional grading. So they really, with A being the best, and it's by appearance alone that those judged as high quality are going to be those that are going to have the better chance of survival. Whereas those that are considered low quality, they don't think that they're going to have a great chance. But I just want to pause here and say there have been studies that have shown over and over again that, again, these laboratories, they don't know everything. And so when they separate these embryos just by morphology alone, just, by looking through a microscope, there have been many examples that when they put these embryos into the low quality category, that they absolutely, if they are given a chance of life, that they will implant, they will survive, and there will not be any severe problems with these babies. So that is the first initial process of the grading, where they really just started to say, which embryos do we think have the highest chance of survival? But they already are starting to put them into buckets as to who they think is better and who is not. And they have made serious mistakes when doing that.
Right. And so what kinds of assumptions are made when a lab technician just ranks high quality or low quality just based on looks? And
Yeah.
that's so interesting because you'd think that science is a little more scientific than that, right? Maybe that's my assumption about it, but maybe I'm just giving the industry too much credit when where there is no credit due.
Yeah, I think you're right. The key word is assumptions. At that point, they're making assumptions and they're doing what's called this time-lapsed imaging. They're watching these embryos grow over the period of a couple of days, right? And what they're seeing is that they have in their head, based on previous experience, that if this embryo grows at this rate, maybe a little, that they appear to be, that they're going to be healthier. They're going to have the highest chance of survival. But we know that there are exceptions to that rule, absolutely, just by these studies that show that embryos that maybe don't grow as fast as they think that they should definitely still have a serious chance and give rise to healthy babies that survive until birth. I will tell you that the whole area of AI, artificial intelligence, is starting to creep into this area of morphology, where they can then use all this time-lapse imaging and data that they have of all of these cycles. And then it's like an algorithm, right? If we have this much data showing that if the embryo looks like this, that it's successful. And so they're trying to compile all of that data and actually bring AI to tell them, what do you think? Kind of take the technician out of it now. What does AI think is the best high quality and low quality? So then we're really getting into dangerous territory, right? Because AI will never have wisdom, ever.
Wow, yes, for sure. So then what happens to the embryos that are deemed poor quality, quote unquote, or surplus?
So embryos that are considered poor quality or surplus, it will really depend on the goal of the parents. So let's just say, and every cycle is different. So let's say that a couple has 20 embryos. If they have 50% of them that are poor and 50% of them that are considered higher quality, then if they know that they have a higher quality embryos that would potentially meet the family's need of how many children they want, and they think that they have a real chance of survival, there absolutely, it is very highly likely that at that stage, the poor embryos will just be discarded or will be considered that there's no chance and they will be sent to the research lab. They could be
Wow.
frozen as well. So there really are three main decisions that these couples have when they're given all of this information. They can immediately transfer them, they can freeze them for later transfer, they can discard them immediately, or they can donate them to research. So it really is going, and that's where the reproductive specialists are and the technicians are going to work with them to try to help them understand what they should do. So let's just say in my case, they considered the three embryos that were created, they considered them to be poor quality. But because
Hmm.
that's all I had, they didn't want to destroy them because they knew that that's all that they had. So they've put all three of them, transferred all three of them back to give the best, to try to give them a chance. None of them survived, but it just kind of shows that every cycle is different. And that's where it's an incredibly difficult decision for these parents to have to make. And so they do try to, tell them, but in the majority of the poor ones eventually are going to be destroyed or sent to research or frozen, unless, if I said, like, they don't have any other options.
Wow. I want to talk also a little bit about genetic screening, so we'll pivot to that topic. What is pre-implantation genetic screening and why is it increasingly used in IVF?
So pre-implantation genetic screening is really a way that, once you identify which embryos are poor quality versus high quality, it's basically the next deeper level of analysis. So these embryos can actually be biopsied in the same way that, like, um, as you're an adult, if you need to do a skin biopsy to find out if there's something wrong with your cells, it's no different. This time you're taking a living human being at the very smallest stage, about, 3 to 5 days old, and you're actually taking some of those cells out
Mhm.
and you're analyzing the DNA. Because as I mentioned, at the very first moment of conception, that baby has all the DNA that they need for life, right? It's complete. But some babies there are genetic problems. I mean, we know that just from that's life, right? We're all different. We're all unique. None of us are perfect. But what they want to do is they want to use pre-implantation genetic screening, or PGT, for testing. They want to actually look at these embryos and say, but which ones actually have the possibility of having a genetic mutation. And there are lots of different types of mutations. So some of the main ones that they look for is what's called aneuploidy. So first they want to know, well, do any of these embryos have an abnormal number of chromosomes? So what they're looking for there is like Down syndrome or trisomy disorders, like trisomy 13 or 18, where the embryo might have like an extra chromosome, okay? A different number of chromosomes than the normal population has. They're still human beings and they have dignity and they have humanity. And Down syndrome, babies live until they're 60s and have an incredible, right? So this reminds me, it is so eugenic for them to then actually kind of uh, to target and look for babies that have abnormalities like Down syndrome or trisomy disorders, and then cast them aside and say, well, you don't want these babies. Okay. That's one thing that they look for. But there are also this screening techniques that can then look at single gene disorders, such as like cystic fibrosis, where they know that this gene, the cystic fibrosis gene, causes cystic fibrosis. So we're going to do a test that looks specifically at just that gene to see if this baby has a chance of having cystic fibrosis. The most concerning part of this right now is that they're like casting a wide net and looking at the entire genome of the embryo and doing what's called a polygenetic screen, where they're looking at all possibilities of the gene and the traits of the human being. And what's concerning about this is because they're trying to use this technique to look at very multiplex diseases that don't have a direct cause, like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, obesity, ones where you can't say, well, this gene actually causes this disease. And so these screens don't work well. They're all based on predictions. We predict that it's possible that your baby might have heart disease based on what's called a polygenic trait score, that's based on looking at all different populations of people that they know have this disease. So it's very inaccurate. But then the more concerning thing, even beyond that, is that they're using this very inaccurate, unreliable screening of these embryos to look even at things at traits that are not disease causing. So they're looking at intelligence. They're looking at eye color. They're looking at height. They're basically putting in front of these parents, they're saying, here, look, these are your 5 embryos. We consider these to be either low quality or high quality, or low quality, poor quality. And on top of that, we can tell you now if your baby has a risk of developing breast cancer, obesity, diabetes, Alzheimer's. Oh, and on top of that, we can tell you how smart your baby might be, IQ, eye color. I mean, and that's not even talking sex selection, because there's a lot of babies that are discarded just because of their sex, their gender, whether they're a girl or a boy. So it's becoming a very, very concerning, controversial area in vitro fertilization, that these embryos, like you had mentioned earlier, they're like seen as inventory, they're seen as commodities, and they just keep manipulating them and analyzing them over and over again. And it's a very eugenic practice, because they're then putting them into buckets as to who they think has the good genes and the bad genes. So it's a very concerning area of in vitro fertilization.
Yeah, there's a lot that we're going to unpack in what you said. Going back to your description, especially about the pre-implantation genetic screening, where they take some of the cells. So imagine you have an embryo that's just multi-celled at this point, and you actually take 1 or 2 cells or however many cells. You're actually taking a whole fraction of their entire being at that point. What kind of effect does that have on the physical development of that child when you're actually taking some of their cells to test? Are there
There are risks of taking, I mean, especially at that stage, these embryos only have about 100, 200 cells total, right? And these cells are the earliest pluripotent cells within the embryo that will give rise to all of the body types of the human body. So there's a couple of issues here. Not only is it traumatic to be able to take, you know, cells out of that embryo that has hardly any cells to begin with, and that they're definitely they're absolutely necessary for the human development of that baby. But it is gonna cause injury then to the embryo. And it's also important to know that it's not a complete picture of what's gonna happen with this baby, because there are issues of mosaicism, and that you could, depending on which cell you choose, that you might see, because there's a lot of these embryos that can actually self-correct these issues. So if you choose one cell that shows you that that baby, might have, let's say, Down syndrome, it's possible that then there was mosaicism, that once given a chance at life, that baby then doesn't have Down syndrome at the end of the day, right? Or the test could be incorrect. So there's a lot of examples in which that mosaicism can actually give an incomplete picture of what, and then they can inaccurately predict what actually is going to happen with that baby. And so that could create a lot of anxiety and stress for the family, because they're making a lot of predictions and assumptions based on an incomplete picture.
Can genetic screening ever be ethical? Are there forms of genetic screening that are always unethical?
So I would say that when you want to do a genetic screen, you have to ask yourself why you're doing that genetic screen. Are you doing the genetic screen just so that you can prepare? Like, what's the intent? Is the intent to prepare, like, to accept this child however God designed that child to be, recognizing that none of us are perfect, and that every human being has dignity, no matter, and they are not defined by their genes and who they are, and what genes they have. So I would say it really depends on the intent. If the intent is to do that genetic screen to be able to just have the information so that you can prepare for pregnancy, like, for example, there are people that will argue, well, I want to have non-invasive pre-implantation, non-invasive prenatal testing, or NIPT, done while the baby is still inside the womb, where you take a sample of the mother's blood and look at the baby's DNA that is circulating through the mother's blood, to get a feel for if the baby has Down syndrome or trisomy disorders. Some parents want to do that because they want to prepare for the baby after birth. But I will tell you that even knowing that that baby has, just even knowing that a baby has a genetic condition, actually is one of the actually one of the worst things you can do for the baby, because there are studies that show that if physicians, when the baby is born, if physicians know that that baby has a disorder like trisomy 13 or 18, they will actually sometimes withhold treatment from the baby. So it's actually to the baby's harm that they actually do this genetic testing, because they don't see the baby as worthy of living. They find that when babies are actually born, when they don't know what the genetic cause is of some of the issues that they're dealing with, they do everything they can to help save these babies. They do all the interventions possible, and then they do the genetic testing. So I would actually argue, when it comes to IVF and this genetic screening, that there is no 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 ethical way to do this at all, because it is inaccurate, it is unreliable, there are so many flaws to this, and it is absolutely eugenic. The discussion about whether to do any genetic testing, I would actually argue, what is the intent? And I would just remember those facts, that there is data showing that is actually to the baby's harm to know when they're born if they have a genetic disorder, because they're not treated the same. The physicians have a bias against them. And it's to remember that you can, after the baby is born, this is the baby that God designed, right? God has a plan for this baby. And after birth, you can always do genetic testing after birth. The DNA is going to be the same, right? But that's why at the very beginning with the IVF and the embryos, there are some major flaws though with that. So I would say that there is never a time ethically that can be done.
Wow, that actually gave me chills. You spoke about the polygenic risk scores, and could you tell us a little bit more about why they are far less reliable and far more ethically dangerous than the public realizes?
Yeah, so there are so many problems with polygenic screening. I want to, first just explain that when it comes to the polygenic screening, It's trying to predict these complex disorders that are influenced by multiple genes. Okay. So they don't have a single genetic cause. They're influenced by multiple genes. That's why it's called polygenetic. But they're also influenced by lifestyle and environmental factors such as exercise, diet, pollutants, right? It's not just the genes alone. So when you're comparing the DNA of these embryos to all other people with or without these complex health conditions, it's only a probable risk, right? It's only a probable risk of heart disease, Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes, cancer, schizophrenia, right? These are just some of the disorders that they're claiming that they can look at. It is not a diagnostic test. It's a prediction, and it can only explain the relative risk for disease. It will never be able to accurately predict this. And in order um, to actually analyze all this data that is based again on populations, you're taking the DNA of the embryo and you're comparing it to all the DNA of human beings over here that have this disease. But what you're doing is then you're basically looking at these large data sets, and you have to use AI to do it. And so you have to train the machine. It's machine learning on large data sets. You have to train the machine, and you have to tell it how to predict the disease, right? And so I think the other major thing that people need to be aware of is that these data sets are primarily only of people of European descent. So there's human bias before you screen the embryo. So not only is there this inherent bias because if you actually look at one of these companies, so there's a company called Heritable. If you go onto their website, they actually show like a pie chart, and they show the percentage of the population that makes up this data. And their quote is, most polygenic scores are trained primarily on people with European ancestries, leaving everyone else with potentially inaccurate predictions. So right there, one of the companies that does this is saying that basically anybody that's not of European descent, it's an inaccurate prediction. You can't even predict it.
Wow.
And we'll go on to say that polygenic risk scores will always be probabilities and not certainties. This is a quote that is made by the National Human Genome Research Institute here in the United States, right? So there's problems with accuracy, reliability, and validation. As I mentioned, the statistical power and the lack of minority groups in these data sets make it virtually inaccurate when you even look at anybody outside European descent. There's programmer bias and error tolerance. So, for example, there was a study that showed that if you screen human embryos for the polygenic trait of just height alone, that it's not accurate. That they actually showed that if you predict how many embryos will actually be tall versus short, that they were only right like 20% of the time. They did the exact same test on the adult population, right? And then they found that it's not even accurate for people when you know what their height is, you know what diseases they have, and not to mention just the eugenics and the discrimination. I mean, you're basically saying, in addition to all the technical flaws and inaccuracies with this technology, it is so eugenic because you are basically saying that these babies with good genes have more value, and they are the ones that we should allow to live. I mean, this is no different than eugenic practices of the past, like with Margaret Sanger, right? Where she was trying to weed out those that she considered inferior, which led to justifying the act of abortion, right? And forced sterilization. It's really no different. And so we really need to look at this. Through the lens of, we are playing God, and we are in our own brokenness determining what we think is a valuable person, and then throwing away the others.
Wow. Yes. This is actually just rebranded eugenics. IVF is in the whole IVF industry. When talking about designer babies, and we already started to discuss that a little bit. So there are some companies where IVF is marketed as customization. So in New York City, there are companies like Nucleus IVF that promote quote unquote IVF plus. And as you mentioned, quote unquote test for sex, height, skin tone, eye color, intelligence, disease risk, etc. And they promise parents on these huge billboards that they put on the subways, etc., promising parents their quote unquote best or healthiest babies. How is this not genetic trait discrimination? And how can they even make these claims based on what you were saying that unless you are of European descent, how can they even have any sense of probability that be able to tell parents that are not of European descent what their chances are of X, Y, or Z baby, designer baby?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, so these are absolutely egregious ads by this direct to consumer company called Nucleus, advertising their IVF plus technology combined with screening these embryos for polygenic disease and traits. I mean, it really is false advertising. I can't say it any more clearly than that. They're wicked schemes to lure these women and men down these paths that lead to, like you said, destruction of human life, because they're basically saying on these billboards, right? Pick your best baby. These babies have great genes, like that somehow those that your worth and your value is determined by your genes. And like you said, and just how inaccurate they are, that they're it's so blatantly false in what they're saying, and they're trying to make it sound like if you don't do this, you're just not on board with reality here. Like, we offer this technology and this is the way to do it. This is the light. And it is just absolutely wicked and evil. I can't say it any other way than that. And I think what's very concerning is if you actually go to their website, your pickyourbaby.com, that they make it sound so easy. I mean, this is just one quote that they're telling these parents. Then your doctor taps a button and the uncertainty lifts. You can see which embryo has the lowest risk for cancer. Finally, you have the clarity you didn't have before, and you can choose the path that feels right for your family. It's like that right there is absolutely false. It is absolutely false, inaccurate, based on the science and what we know, that these tests are they're not even tests. I can't even call it a test, because it's a pure screen, and it's a predictor only. There is no answer that you are given that is accurate. So the fact that they're making these parents think that this is normal and it's easy, and that there's no risks, it's just, it's absolutely wicked and evil. That's the only other way I can say it.
That's crazy. So why aren't states regulating companies like this and the claims they're making? I mean, I could
Yeah.
see this being a liability, right? They're making promises and claims that they can't deliver on because they're just predicting factors. They can't actually deliver on what they're promising here.
Yeah, no, that's exactly true. And right now, because the IVF industry is so unregulated, right now there is nothing that is being done. And so we absolutely, that's why there's no oversight or accountability for genetic screening. These laboratories can be accredited, right? So there is a type of lab accreditation. Like when I ran a laboratory, right, there are different levels of accreditation to make sure that you actually can offer what you're saying that you're actually doing what you're telling people that you can do. And so when it comes to just the basic IVF, many of these IVF companies are accredited. And so like they come in and they have some oversight, but it's very basic. But companies like this that have what's called CLIA accreditation, it's the very basic bare bones, right? They're not going to have the same type of a strong regulatory oversight. And the FDA has they've pretty much stepped back from this, and the FDA doesn't come in and provide any oversight when it comes to these lab developed tests, because they've pretty much wiped their hands and said, we want science to be able to advance, but we're not going to come in and tell laboratories how they can do this. And this is a major flaw right now that needs some oversight, especially when we start talking AI and using that. And so we definitely need stronger accountability and oversight when it comes to these laboratories. And
You can see how people can fall into the allure of quote unquote designer babies because of these false promises that are made by companies. And especially if most people are not informed as to what is involved with IVF, how these screenings are done, the ethical risks of these screenings, even the fact that these screenings are not very accurate predictors of actually what's going to happen with those embryos when they grow up. But how do we get here? How do we get here so quickly in terms of this idea of a designer baby?
I think we got here so quickly because science is advancing so quickly, and a lot of these scientists just know that they can do this, but they're not stopping to think that they should. And so this is the first step. It's a slippery slope of designer babies. That first you're weeding out those that you consider to be inferior. You're casting aside those that you don't think have good genes. I mean, it reminds me, it's no different than what we're seeing in the abortion industry, where when babies are prenatally diagnosed with Down syndrome, they have well over a 60% chance of being killed in the womb by abortion just because they have been prenatally diagnosed with Down syndrome. I mean, we know that Iceland virtually has no Down syndrome babies ever since the onset of this screening happened. And so it's no different with in vitro fertilization, that we're just designing, we're creating in our own human image, not God's image, what we think is the is the it are the human beings that have the best value and are considered the highest quality, and that's just absolutely wrong. It's eugenic. And I think it's going to get even worse as we start seeing gene editing. I mean, that's what we saw with the Chinese scientists that ended up gene editing these baby embryos, and then transferring them into the womb, so that not only now are we saying, okay, well, now we're just going to eliminate babies once we find out that they have genes we don't want, but now you have people like the Chinese scientists that are going to do what's called heritable germline editing, that's going to say, well, now we're just going to fix those genes and make them what we think that they should be, which is going down a road that we are literally, it's like the movie Gattaca. We are literally designing babies the way that we think they should be. And it is trying to create this perfect baby. And it is so eugenic. It is no different than what we saw back at the early 1900s, when you would have these, in the 1900s, there were literally fairs that were they were trying to say, well, this is what a healthy baby looks like. So they would have these state fairs like the Fitter Family Fair. They would have these Better Baby contests. They would actually give diplomas to families that they felt had the perfect baby. No joke. Like, if you look at the Smithsonian Museum website and just search Better Baby, this is no different than, this is just history repeating itself. But like you said earlier, this is just a modern form of eugenics that we've seen before, and eliminating those that we think are less valuable, and ignoring the fact that all human beings from the moment of conception have human dignity and worth, no matter what their genes are.
Absolutely. Perfectly said. And just to clarify, the reason that Iceland virtually has no children, no adults with Down syndrome isn't because Down syndrome as a condition has been eliminated, but because those children were eliminated. They were aborted before they could even have a chance at being born. And so instead of trying to find cures for conditions, they're just eliminating people. I just wanted to clarify that too, because how eugenic is that? To eliminate, to kill preborn babies just because of whatever the condition they may have. So what message does this send about children and parenthood? How are children being reframed from gifts to products when you're looking at them through the lens of quote unquote having a designer baby?
I think, like you said, they're being looked at as products. It's like picking a perfect baby off the shelf. It's like when you go into a grocery store and you say, well, I like coffee, so I want to know what the best coffee is. Well, what is that based off of? Is it based off of your opinion? Is it based off of like, whose opinion decides what the best coffee is, right? Everybody has their own opinion. And that's the problem that we have here. Everybody in this fallen society, in a broken society, but that is a sinful society. Only God has wisdom and knows in his perfect love and nature what the plan and purpose is for every human being. And for us as human beings to decide who we think has value, we are treating these babies no more than we would an item in the grocery store. That we're just picking, we're going to put together what we think is the perfect bundle of joy that we in our heads determine and what society tells us, right? That perfect somehow means devoid of disease, that perfect somehow means that you have a high IQ. We know, we know from the teachings in the Bible that God flips everything upside down. He says, no, that's pride. First, do you remember the Tower of Babel, right? And what I did when you tried to play God, right? When you sought out for yourself what you thought was good. And that's the real danger that we're heading down here. This is a warning to us as in our society, trying to make decisions, life decisions that impact human beings and who will live and who will die. That is playing God. And we are going down a path that is just getting further and further away from God's wisdom. And we are going to be destroyed as a humanity because of it if we don't stop this soon.
Absolutely. And I think your discussion about the fact that human beings are being treated like products even by their parents. Obviously, when you go and pick a coffee, if you don't like it or whatever the case may be, you could say, "Well, I want to return it." But what happens when you're promised a certain baby and then another type of baby is actually born to you because those predictions were wrong? There's no quote unquote refund on a baby. Or what if your lab technician tells you we're going to implant the low quality babies? Imagine the kind of relationship the parent will have with that child if that child is born, having that as the undergirding assumption of their child that somehow child was a low quality embryo before being implanted. Could you talk about that aspect and kind of the relationship that creates that dysfunctional relationship that it even creates between parents and their own children?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. Like this is something that I think people aren't thinking about. Like they do this screening and there are, like we said, that there are flaws, there are inaccuracies, there are mistakes that are being made. I mean, we talked about one of the major mistakes just in getting the wrong embryo implanted. But yeah, let's say you do one of these pre-implantation genetic screens and go to the extreme and do the polygenetic screening where you're looking at traits. So all of a sudden you pick the baby that has the highest IQ, but then all of a sudden you realize, well, actually, no, that baby actually doesn't have the same IQ that they predicted. So what are you going to do? All of a sudden, are you going to not love the child?
What kind of dynamic does this create between parents and children when the result isn't what they expected?
Instead of that loving relationship between a mother and a child, between a father and a child, and accepting the child that is a gift, right? And the gift that God has given them, and he has a purpose for that child, and that's why he created them. It takes all of that away, and it now puts it into this camp where you as a parent have decided what type of child you want and what's going to happen if you don't get the child that you initially wanted, that you thought in your own human flawed condition was going to be the child for you. What if all of a sudden you wanted a child that was going to be 6'2" and now you ended up with a child that's 5'1" because the lab inaccurately predicted the height of your child, which we know can absolutely happen. Like, are you still going to love that child? Well, I'm sure you will, but that whole the excitement of the uniqueness of every human being is really taken out of this. Again, going back to God's ordained divine plan for us. We are just completely thinking that we know best. And we have learned from history time and time again that when we start putting value on certain other people just because of how they look or how they act or what they do, or now in the case of what their genes look like, it is going to fail. We are going to be misled down a path that is not on grace and love and acceptance and just the joy of just having a gift of life. It is now going to be on this, like you said, like this it's like a product. It's like it's this relationship is now becomes more of a commodity and a product and less about just acceptance and love and grace.
Beautifully said. We discussed the eugenic component of this at length, but I also wanted to touch upon how you would answer those who argue that doing these types of screenings or picking the quote unquote higher quality embryos, how that reduces sufferings or improves outcome. That's what they claim in this, that the end goal is to reduce suffering, improve outcomes. How do you answer that claim? And also, at what point does disease prevention or genetic trait selection actually cross into modern eugenics? Can you even do any of those things without actually it being eugenics already?
No, you can't. We don't eliminate people in order to eliminate disease, like what you said earlier with Down syndrome. I mean, that was the way that they actually eliminated disease in Down syndrome in their country was by actually aborting and killing those babies with Down syndrome. This is no different. You're basically saying that in order to eliminate this X or Y disease that we think needs to be gone and eliminated, we're going to eliminate the person. That is absolutely eugenic from the very beginning. We don't do that with we don't do that after people are birth. We don't say after people are born, we don't say, well, we thought we were going to have a baby with a perfect heart, but you don't have a heart that functions properly. So we're just going to cast you aside and not take care of you. No, we look for treatments that are available that are going to help repair that defect. This is not that at all. We're saying we are not even going to give you a chance at life. We are going to discard you and we are going to destroy you because we don't think you're worthy to live because of the genes that you have. That is incredibly eugenic. And then when we start to get into selecting human beings just because of their non-disease traits, that's when you get into full-fledged designer baby. We are creating we are trying to create what we in our minds consider to be the perfect baby. And I think this really gets at to a very spiritual issue in our country and our culture, that somehow we are so desperate on eliminating suffering and disease that we are willing to kill and destroy human beings in the process, and in order to do that. And that's where I think the scientists get so caught into this, that they think that somehow this is a good thing because we're getting rid of disease. I mean, I heard one of the directors of these companies talk in this way. He said, well, why isn't this a good thing? Like, a family has had this inherited disease that has been passed on. They want to, stop it. They want to stop it at this generation and they don't want to see it again. And it's like, well, no, there's nothing wrong in wanting to stop the disease, but let's not destroy the individual in order to stop the disease. Let's actually look for ethical, um, techniques and technologies that are saving lives now that don't rely on any human destruction. And that's where we get into this whole incredible area of gene therapy, cell and gene therapies that are being used now to save babies, to save children, that once they are born, they discover they have these rare disorders, and they are using these gene therapies to be actually able to personalize the treatment just for them, using all ethical means to do so. I mean, baby KJ is probably the best example of this. So he had a rare disease that put his life at risk. And thanks to a collaborative effort at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and other agencies, that became the first patient to receive a custom gene editing therapy. And he is now home and thriving. And so it was not done by doing any inherited gene editing where it's going to affect the human race. This was done by just saying, you know what? He has this disease and we're going to help to treat it ethically, and we're going to just target it, and we're going to not eliminate him in the process or any other human being to try to save his life.
Yes, and those are encouraging stories. And since we're pivoting to the gene editing and aspect of things. There are technologies like CRISPR that, with the temptation to quote unquote fix, and that temptation grows. Can you talk a little bit more about the difference between gene editing that is done ethically and gene editing that is not done ethically, and what are the strict limits to make sure that we stay on the track of ethical gene editing?
Yeah, so there really are two different types of gene editing. One, the unethical version, if I put it like into big boxes, the one box is heritable germline editing. So that's considered very controversial, very unethical. It's where once you have that sperm egg fusion that creates that embryo at the very earliest stages, then they use this CRISPR technology to actually make DNA changes very early in development. So as I mentioned, like early on in development, that baby has all the DNA that they need for life. Well, they're actually going in and saying, well, we don't like this gene, so we're going to take it out, or we're going to change it, or we're going to add something else in. And so that's the whole idea. The problem here is that the edited gene, whatever the target is, that's going to be copied into every new cell that is in that baby for life. And the big thing is that it's also going to be in the baby's gametes, the sperm and the egg cells. What that means is that that edited gene is going to be passed on to future generations. We are literally changing the human race. And we know from the case, like with the Chinese scientist, when he did this, like there are major problems with this technique. I mean, we knew that he tried to alter the genomes of these twin baby girls so that they would not be infected with HIV. And they were born in 2018, but they have had negative unanticipated outcomes. It didn't work the way that he thought. That's not even talking that, the whole technique is not optimized to the point where you might not even get the right gene right that you're targeting. So you could have disastrous outcomes. So this is a really controversial area that is being looked at very closely. The type of technique that I was talking about earlier with baby KJ is that they do what's called somatic cell gene editing, in which these are therapies that target DNA genes in specific cells after the baby is born, right? And these edited genes then are contained only in the targeted cells that are diseased. And so the changes are going to be limited just to treat the individual. It won't be passed on to future generations. It's kind of like a heat-seeking missile, right? You're just going to go straight to where the disease is. You're going to repair it, and you're going to get out. And it's not going to affect future generations. And this is just an amazing therapy that they're really hoping can be personalized to each individual after birth and not cause any of these major controversial concerns, like heritable gene editing does.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible what we can do with science. That science can be used for good and it could be used for evil. And obviously, there are gene editing techniques, as you mentioned, that can cure disease. But with the human germline, the human germline experimentation, I would call it, really. Um, is that even allowed legally? I mean, how is China doing it? Because obviously this is not only affecting those individuals, but as you mentioned, this gets passed down through generations. So there's scientists who are tinkering with people's genes, and then these people end up having children who carry those same genes, and that just kind of spreads like wildfire into culture when those people have children and grandchildren and great grandchildren. So, what limits are there in this industry?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So first, I want to point out that that study with the Chinese scientist, in which he actually was able to genetically engineer these embryos and then gestate them until birth, that is not allowed in the United States right now. There's a couple of things that are holding that back. So we have what's called the Dickey-Wicker Amendment, and this is which kind of helps to hold this in place, in which the embryos cannot be created for research purposes. Um, and research in which human embryos or embryos are destroyed, discarded, or knowingly subjected to risk or injury or death.
So, what limits are there to things like the human germline editing?
So the limits that are in place in the United States are really twofold. One, no federal funding can be used to actually create an embryo for research purposes. You can use private and state funding for that. So that's why embryo research still continues. But at least at the federal level, there's not supposed to be any federal funding used to do that. And that's under the Dickey-Wicker Amendment. The other important limitation that we have in the United States is what's called the Aderholt Amendment. That's what prohibits a human embryo from intentionally being created, modified, and then transferred into a woman that will be then gestated. So the Aderholt Amendment really is what's the hold that's in place. That's will prohibit any of this from happening in the United States right now. People can play around with these embryos a lot. There's a lot of research that can happen with private funding, with state funding. They can manipulate these, they can create these embryos, they can manipulate them, they can destroy them, they can do all kinds of weird genetic experiments with them, and there's nothing stopping them from doing that. They just can't use federal dollars for that. But even if they were to optimize it at this point and say, hey, we have a great embryo here that's been genetically edited, they cannot under this Aderholt Amendment, they cannot gestate that human being. So what you see happening though is you have a lot of people pushing for what's called these 3-parent embryos, because they actually have been shown to increase, mothers in particular, the ones that have the mitochondrial disorders, because they transfer the mitochondrial DNA to their offspring. So women that have what's called a mitochondrial disorder, they find that if they basically take her disease DNA out, but just keep the good DNA, and then bring in another woman's good mitochondrial DNA, and then fuse us, and then make an embryo by bringing in a sperm, then you basically have what's called 3-parent embryos. So you have an embryo that has DNA from 2 moms and 1 dad. So that is definitely going on, but they cannot make that happen in the United States. So you see these reproductive specialists then creating these 3-parent embryos and then going down to Mexico and having their babies. So with any of this genetic editing, there's a lot of playing around and manipulation that's happening. There are calls for a moratorium on this. We know that, there's a couple of things that we want to see happen that would actually be much stronger policies. We want to see a global moratorium on all heritable germline editing. We don't want to see any of this going on, right? This is just way too risky. We want to see no creation of any embryos for research anymore. We absolutely want to eliminate all funding for all of this research, but we definitely just want to stop the practice in general. And this is where we really need to just continue to remind policymakers that there are much stronger actions that can take place just to stop this horrible practice that is really controversial and is eliminating young lives in the process and creating some really risky experiments that, if that ever were to be allowed, could absolutely change our human race.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, countries like China and Mexico have looser laws, but this can affect the whole human race. So there definitely needs to be a moratorium put in place to make sure that this isn't happening anywhere. Just because it's not necessarily happening to the extent that it's happening in other countries doesn't mean it doesn't affect us. It affects the whole human race. And so this is something of urgent need, that we stop this kind of unethical research. Recently, the NIH decided to block the use of human fetal tissue in research. Can you explain this decision and why it's ethically and scientifically significant?
Yeah, this is amazing news. And I'm pulling up the announcement here. And this was incredible because we were actually, we were having our first Hill briefing at the Capitol when this happened on January 22nd. And when the NIH announced that effective immediately on the date of the notice on January 22nd, that no NIH funds would be permitted for research using human fetal tissue from elective abortions. So this was great news because the body parts of these babies, this human trafficking of these organs, eyes, hearts, brain, lungs, you name it, these babies that had just been aborted, that no more would their bodies be dissected and then trafficked to basically the highest bidder, these researchers that desire to use them and exploit them in the name of science and do experiments on them. So it was really good to see this grisly chapter of human experiments close, and that no more American tax dollars are going to be used to fund this research. And I think it's really important that people understand that this did not stop anybody from being treated. This did not stop any cures from occurring, because in over 100 years of research, human fetal tissue research has not led to any cures. It is, if anything, it's old science that doesn't work. It's been shown to be tons of flaws. And it's just, there are so many better ethical alternatives that are working even better. So we were just very excited. I want to just pause, though, and say that this research isn't completely stopped in the United States. People can absolutely, again, similar to the embryo research, they can use private funds, they can use state funds to continue this research. So these biobanks that house these body parts of human beings from abortion still exist. So there's still more work to be done in this area. This is an important first step, but we need to stop all of this research because it doesn't work well at all. And we just need to shut down these tissue banks that sell these baby body parts. It's horrific. It's absolutely horrific.
Right. We can't build science on the backs of babies that were torn apart.
Right.
We can do science and we can advance finding treatments for all kinds of diseases, but we can do so ethically. And I think that this sends the message home that unethical science is not welcome, that we really
Yeah.
need to focus on solutions that are ethical. And again, the ends don't justify the means. And the means have to be good as well as the ends. I want to just pivot now really to the big picture. Why do you think that most people misunderstand what's involved with IVF, embryo selection, and the designer baby conversation? And if you had one message to someone who doesn't know this world the way that we just discussed in this episode, what would you tell them?
I would tell them that while these advancements in science appear to be helping humans, while they appear to be resulting in life, like in the case of in vitro fertilization, people need to pause and really think about the ethics and what is at stake here for not only the risks that are immediate to the parents that are going through these procedures, especially the women, but they have to stop and think about the risks that are and the destruction that is happening to these embryos. And that's not even to mention how eugenic these practices are. So that's what SALT really wants to do. We want people to understand the science. We want them to understand that these advancements in science are not bad. We actually support them, and we think it's great that we can use our minds, our God-given minds, to try to eliminate suffering and to help people and to eradicate disease. We think that those goals are good, but we have also seen that there is a right way and there is a wrong way to do this. There is a right way to do this that doesn't risk or harm any individual. There is a way to do this that is God fearing, that is God honoring, and that respects the dignity of each and every human being. And when you start to get into some of these advanced practices like in vitro fertilization, gene editing, pre-implantation genetic screening, it is crossing the line, and human lives are being lost, and it is eugenic, and we are discarding and destroying human lives just because they are not considered valuable or they don't have the right genes.
Powerfully said. What logic do you think is being underlying message is being sent to people with disabilities, with genetic conditions, or traits deemed quote unquote undesirable when you have a culture that's pushing for designer babies?
It's absolutely sending the message that they don't have value, that somehow as a society we have decided that your disease defines you, and you are not valued because of that, and you could put into that blank box whatever you want, and that's the problem. And everybody's going to have a different opinion on this, right? You're going to have some people that say, well, I think that this is what values a person, this trait. And If anything, the Bible teaches us over and over again that our identity is not in our bodies. Our identity is not in our genes, right? While this is amazing and it provides amazing uniqueness among us, and God has used that diversity, right, to do, for his purposes, like to make this amazing human race that is diverse. None of us are the same. No, none of us will ever be the same. But that's not what defines us. Our identity is in Christ. And that's what we need as a society. Eradicating disease is never going to be our savior, right? We're all on, once we were born, we were all on this path to death. Suffering is inevitable, death is inevitable. We can't stop that. And I think that's what's happening in science sometimes, is that they're trying so hard to eradicate disease and to stop death. I mean, you hear these stories where they're trying to, even take people that are centurions, right, that have lived over the age of 100, and they want to analyze their DNA so that they can try to find what's the secret to living long, right? I mean, it's like that's not what we're here for. We're not here to live forever. That's what's so dangerous about this technology, that there's so much focus on health, and that anybody that doesn't meet that definition of what they consider to be healthy is considered less valuable. That's the real risk.
To add to that, it's that everybody born will have some risk or some condition for something. So it really endangers all of our value and dignity when any one person or any disease is eliminated to match their agenda or their vision for the human person. So for
Right.
couples who struggling with infertility right now, what do you want them to hear without judgment but with complete honesty?
Hmm. So couples that are struggling with infertility right now, I want them to hear honestly that I understand their struggle. I personally understand their struggle. I personally understand that desire to have a biological child, one that you dreamed of for your whole life. And wherever you are in your journey, I just want them to know that it's going to be okay. I don't know what the path is that God has designed for you, and only He knows. And so my message to them is to live, if they really believe in their hearts that they're supposed to consider in vitro fertilization. I would tell them to ask lots of questions, do research the pitfalls, go in with their eyes wide open, talk to them very seriously about, if you believe in your heart you're supposed to do that, how are there ways that we can do this, that it does not eliminate young lives? Testify, witness to them, so that, that human dignity really matters to you if you decide to go through this. And I would also encourage people to just not just to jump into it, to consider the restorative healthcare options that are available to them. I wish that would have been available and more clear to me when I was at this journey. I wish I would have gone there first. And that's what I would encourage people to do, to not give up hope that God has a plan, but to also put it into his hands, and to just go in with your eyes wide open and to not be deceived, because so much of what is out there is they are telling you things that you want to hear.
Right. And also for our listeners from the Catholic perspective, there is really no ethical way to do IVF. But as Tara mentioned, restorative reproductive medicine helps couples with infertility and there are techniques that are ethical. And so we will do a whole show just on these restorative reproductive technologies that respect the human life from the very beginning, the embryo, and hopefully that'll help couples who are facing and struggling with infertility. Finally, if science gives us unprecedented power over human life, what moral virtues must guide us so that power doesn't eclipse human dignity?
I would actually argue that we never have power to begin with.
Mhm.
I would actually argue, as a human race, while we think we have the power to do this, God is in complete control. And And we can never lose sight of the fact that every human being from the moment of conception has human dignity, and there is sanctity in human life. And God is the great designer, the great creator, and he has a plan and purpose for every life. And so as a society, scientifically, as we go forward with these advancements, and I guess I would say we use that God-given power that he has ordained and allowed to do certain techniques at the forefront, we always have to recognize that these are human beings from the moment of conception, that they are no different than you or me. They're just at a different age in life. That's what I think people have to really recognize, that all of these techniques, they're just at a different stage. You and I were both embryos at the one cell stage, and and then we all went through that. And so we can't just cast aside human life for the sake of that power. And just because we can doesn't mean that we should. So we need to very carefully and thoughtfully and prayerfully consider every single step. And anything that starts to cross the line where human life is at danger or at risk, that's where it needs to stop.
Beautifully said, Tara. We thank you so much for being with us, sharing your knowledge, expertise, and also your personal experience with IVF. It is very powerful to hear that, and I know that our listeners really appreciate it. So thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Here are my 5 key takeaways from my conversation with Tara Sander Lee, a Harvard-trained biochemist and founding board member of the Science Alliance for Life and Technology, on designer babies and when IVF becomes human design. 1. IVF has shifted from quote-unquote treatment to selection. IVF was introduced as a way to help couples overcome infertility, even though, as we've discussed, it is fraught with ethical problems. But today, it increasingly involves grading embryos, screening genetic traits, and selecting which embryos are chosen, thus introducing a system of human selection. 2. Eugenic embryo grading quietly ranks human life. Inside IVF labs, embryos are routinely evaluated and ranked based on morphology and development speed. While presented as a clinical tool, this grading system determines which embryos are transferred, frozen, or discarded, raising profound questions about modern-day eugenics and how we define human worth at the earliest stage of life. 3. Polygenic risk scores promise more than science can deliver. Unlike screening for single-gene disorders, polygenic risk scores attempt to predict additional complex traits like intelligence, height, BMI, or mental health risk. But these predictions are probabilistic, population-based, and often unreliable. Yet they are increasingly marketed as tools for choosing a quote-unquote better baby. 4. The designer baby marketplace is already here. Companies are now openly promoting IVF as a way to quote-unquote optimize children, offering selection for sex, physical traits, and genetic risk factors. What was once science fiction is becoming a commercial model, reframing children from gifts to customizable products and outcomes. 5. The real question isn't just about can we, but should we? With tools like embryo screening and CRISPR gene editing, science now has unprecedented power over human life. The ethical question is no longer hypothetical. As reproductive technology advances, society must decide whether medicine is meant to heal people or redesign them. Because truth matters and human dignity isn't optional. This is Bioethics, babe. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Bioethics Babe podcast. If you've enjoyed this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and your favorite podcast platform, and share with your friends and family. Also check out bioethicsbabe.com for the latest episodes and resources.